Thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Brett, for inviting me. Brett is one of the very first people I met in Washington, D.C. About 25 years ago, I showed up fresh out of college, was placed at a table like this at a dinner, and I met him, and he's been helping and supporting me for 25 years, so thank you. I do have 6 kids. I'm also a journalist, and so being a dad and a journalist, what we do is we tell stories. So I'm going to try to tell you guys some stories here. The big story I have to tell, it's a story about the American dream, which is sort of a hokey term, but also the widely held belief that the American dream is dead. So this is a story about work, it's a story about faith, it's a story about family and community. Unfortunately, this story also runs into politics, so you'll have to forgive me for that a little bit, because I'm a political reporter, and so the way I came to this story, the way that I came to visit the different parts of the country I'll talk about, was partly through covering elections. And because I'm a political reporter, my story begins in Iowa. Because I'm an Irish Catholic, my story begins in a bar. Thank you. It was Joe's Place in Iowa City. And so there was a couple I met there. They worked at the university there. And I was covering the 2016 Iowa caucuses. And as I was there, the couple, they told me that they were from Orange City, which is in northwest Iowa. As I said, I'm an Irish Catholic, and so the color orange occasionally can trigger me. And so I asked, I said, what is Orange City? Why is it orange? Is this like a bunch of Northern Irish Ulstermen marching around? She said, no. They're Dutch, is what she explained. And I was like, okay, now here's the thing. I'm from New York. We have real ethnicities in New York. You got Italians, you got Irish, you got Polish. But in Midwest outside of Chicago, do you really have ethnicity? She said, listen, just let me explain what it was like for me. This woman, her name was Holly Vander something, and she explained that as a kid, she used to walk wearing wooden clogs past Windmill Square for their annual Tulip Festival. It sounded like this was like a Simpsons episode send-up of Dutch people in Midwest. So I had to go out there. So I went out there, out to Sioux County, Iowa, to Orange City. And Sioux County, Iowa is the most Dutch county in America, according to the U.S. Census. And Sioux Center was another city out there in Sioux County. And as I said, I was a political reporter, so I covered a Jeb Bush rally. And the first thing I encountered was a woman who explained she was named after Wilhelmina, the queen of the Netherlands during both World Wars. But I've met a pastor, and I talked to him about this town. And one of the things he mentioned was that it was a very conservative place. And remember, if you can go back in time to the 2016 Iowa caucuses, you've got Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, John Kasich, and there were supporters of all of those, of the 900 people who show up at his church every Sunday. But there weren't people showing up to back Donald Trump. Eventually, this county would vote for him, but in that Republican caucus, he didn't find a lot of supporters there. And sure enough, this was his worst county. Sioux County ended up being Trump's worst county in the Iowa caucuses, then his best county in the general election, which meant this was a very Republican place, but it didn't have an interest in him. Now, I'm not going to talk about Donald Trump specific, his personality, his policies, or anything. I was just curious, what made some places go for him so early, and some places not? And it had to do with the words he said right before the first time he said, "Make America Great Again." He said, "The American dream is dead." And a lot of America said, yes, the American dream is dead. But something about these Dutch people in Orange City and Sioux County, they were like, nah, I don't think the American dream is dead. I think it's alive and well here. So I would ask when I visited a place like this, I said, what is it that makes Sioux County different than so much of rural America? And there was one professor who said, well, out here, everyone, they may vote right, but they live left. And I thought, well, what does he mean by that? Did I just stumble upon a really big story out here? Is this a bunch of swingers or something out here? He said, no. What I mean is they really care about the environment and they really take care of their neighbors. And I thought, I don't like that as a left-right distinction, but I knew what he meant, that it wasn't a sort of super individualist, get off my lawn type place. The New Yorker ended up writing about Sioux County, and what they said was, their description of it, they said, out here there are plenty of jobs. It'll take you 5 minutes to drive to work. When you have children, we'll help you take care of them. People here share your values. It's a good Christian place, and they care about you. If anything happens, they'll have your back. And so I started to realize this is the kind of place that we think about, and that when we worry about the problems of a lot of rural America, we think, well, isn't rural America a bunch of, small towns where everybody knows each other and everybody has your back? And the answer in America is increasingly, it's not. And following the Dutch around helped me figure it out. I went out to Wisconsin before that primary. I went to a town called Oostburg. So Oostburg is about 50% Dutch. And I got there on a Sunday morning. I planted myself at Judy's Place, which is a diner. And I started to see one of the things that made this place look really different. Because as I sat at the diner counter, families came pouring in from the 9 o'clock services at First Reformed Church. And then the 9 o'clock at Bethel Orthodox Presbyterian. They went on a little longer, so their families came in a little late. Then the 9:15 at the First Presbyterian Church let out, followed by the 9:30 at the First Christian Reformed Church. This is in a village of 2,000 people, and there's 4 churches that all are basically these Reformed churches. And I started to realize a lot of them were going to go back for Bible study around 6 p.m. One of the things that made these Dutch communities so extraordinary was that they had these very strong institutions of civil society. The Dutch refugees that had settled there didn't just plant churches. They made sure to plant Christian schools and public schools, build a diner, build a library. They built institutions. And so then when I looked at these different counties where I found these strong Dutch places, which on an electoral map, people who rejected the idea that America was dead, the American dream was dead, what characterized them was very strong institutions of civil society. And it wasn't just the Dutch, of course. You can see this if you go out west to places where there's huge populations of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church. Everywhere you turn, there's a new institution. There's a soup kitchen. There's a public school. There's a private school. And I saw closer to home as well in the neighborhood near my old house in Maryland, which has 2 Orthodox synagogues. So the people who go there have to walk every Saturday. They don't drive. The parking lot is wide open on Saturdays. And so what does that build? That builds a very tight-knit community where people know one another. But what else does it build? It builds a kindergarten. It builds a little gym. It's one of these commercial places, but it's built around the Orthodox community. It builds a playground. And in these places, you see the American dream seems more alive. Look at the statistics on these, and you'll see better outcomes and all of that. It was funny living near there when you have 6 kids. People in the grocery store, they make assumptions about you. And so my wife would be checking out, and the checkout lady would warn her that the bacon she was buying was not, in fact, kosher. And they would send her down to the kosher food aisle. When I was in Maryland, I was also near a neighborhood called Chevy Chase, which is the village of Chevy Chase is the wealthiest municipality in the D.C. area, which unfortunately is one of the wealthiest areas in this country, which is the wealthiest country in the history of the world. Chevy Chase, to delve back into politics a little, voted a lot in the primaries, like Oostburg, like Orange City, like Kemp Mill, the Jewish neighborhood, in that for the Republicans among them, they supported a Marco Rubio in Chevy Chase. They supported Ted Cruz in the more religious places. But they weren't interested in the guy who said the American dream is dead. Because if you go to Chevy Chase, when I visited there was a father-daughter dance just for the neighborhood that was sponsored by a local organization. They have their own newspaper for a village of the same size as Oostburg. And it's different. The average home in Oostburg cost $150,000 back then, while the average home in Chevy Chase was 10 times that. The mean household income in the village of Chevy Chase was $420,000 back then. And so this was the sort of place that had some weird echoes of these religious communities I went to. And just like in these smaller, more religious neighborhoods, people finish high school, they get married, they have kids, they get involved in their kids' lives, and then they serve the community. And so while 50% of the babies born in America right now are born outside of wedlock, that's not true in Oostburg, that's not true in Salt Lake City, and that's not true in Chevy Chase. And college-educated men, who make up everybody, basically, who lives in the village of Chevy Chase, are much more likely to get married and half as likely to get divorced. So we see 2 different kinds of places that politically, again, did not seem to believe the American dream was dead, and that have these two outcomes, these religious places and these highly educated, wealthy places. But what I realize is that they're not two different types of place, they're just one. These are the places where the American dream is alive because they're planted thick with many overlapping institutions of civil society. And they have so much community bonds because there are these clubs, these organizations that bind them. A wise woman once said, "It takes a village to raise a child." Well, Chevy Chase and Oostburg, despite how different they are these institutions. And so the problem is that places like that are becoming rarer and rarer because the institutions of civil society in America are fewer and they're weaker. Much of the country, they're gone. And so this is how we have to talk about the afflictions facing America, whether it's the struggling of the working class and the middle class, the opioid epidemic, our fractured politics. The problem is this: too few places have too few robust institutions of civil society. And the people there are left alienated, they're left lacking a safety net and lacking a sense of purpose. They don't have connectivity, modeling, and thus access to the good life. Now, sometimes when I talk to college kids about this, I have to tell them the importance of what community does. This is an audience that understands that well. But the kids who end up in college, it's not that they're unfamiliar with community. If you end up going to college, it means you're in the elite. And it probably means that for you, belonging to things is like trying to explaining that to a college kid is like trying to explain water to a fish. Because they were probably raised by a pair of married parents who put them on a sports team, who put them into an orchestra, who knew their neighbors, who the parents volunteered. And so I have to explain what belonging to an institution does. And again, I use that word belonging because it really matters. One story is the story of my youngest child when she was just about 1 year old. She was feeling really sick. And if you've ever had like an 11-month-old baby who's moving all around and all of a sudden she gets a little cold, parents don't like to admit it, but you kind of like it, because then she just rests there very calmly on your shoulder. It's very sweet. You're not chasing her around, worrying about her pulling on the dog's tail or anything like that. And so this is happening one Sunday morning. One of the advantages of being a Catholic is that we have like 5 different mass times on any given Sunday. So we do what I call the divide and conquer. I went with most of the kids to the early mass. My wife went with just the oldest to the late mass, so that somebody was always watching little Eve. And during that late mass, I'm home alone. I'm home with the other kids and Eve, and she goes from sort of lethargic to collapsed. And I found one of those pulse oximeters that measures the oxygen content in her blood, and it came up with a number of like 85%. And I didn't know what that meant, but I Googled it, and it said anything below 90 is really bad. We had only one car, and so I tried calling my wife. You know, you turn your phone off during church, and so she doesn't hear it. And at this point in our life, we didn't really know our next-door neighbors very well. So I just put Eve in a jogging stroller and started sprinting the 1.5 miles to the urgent care center. Kept calling and texting Katie. Finally, she realizes her phone's vibrating, and so she goes down and she looks, and she meets me at the urgent care center, ends up in an ambulance taking Eve to the local hospital where she had been born, and then the local hospital can't get enough oxygen into her lungs, so they take her to Children's Hospital. Eve ends up totally fine once they get enough oxygen in her lungs, but for 4 days, we're in Children's Hospital in Washington, D.C., 45 minutes from our house. My kids never ate so well as they did those 4 days. And most of you know what I mean. Our second fridge was overflowing. My kids always talk about it. The sandwiches were great. Our lunch was the best ever. I'm usually the one who makes their lunch, so this was not necessarily a compliment. So many friends brought us so much stuff. In fact, I almost got in trouble at the hospital because somebody delivered me a 6-pack of beer, which apparently was against the rules. And one of the nurses was like, "Why are you guys getting so much stuff? Who are these people who keep coming by the hospital?" Not knowing that twice as many were going by the house. And I said, as I was listing them, it occurred to me. I said, well, that was a couple from our neighborhood pool. That woman is in the book club with my wife. I coached Little League with that guy. I coached their child in basketball. And that's somebody from our parish. And I realized every description to all these relationships, there was a hub in the middle. You sometimes think of your friendships as a bilateral thing, right? There's two of you, right? But no, there was always a thing. The book club, the church, the school, the team. Our belonging to these organizations was an insurance product for us. We didn't realize it. And when we needed it, it came in with surplus. When I told this story once, there was a guy who told me that his neighbor once showed up with a tray of food and was like, Dave, I've got a tray of food and cancer. He's like, wait, what? Oh yeah, I got diagnosed with cancer 2 days ago, and people brought me so much food that I can't fit it in my freezer. This is what happens when you belong to tight-knit societies. Oh, final detail on that Eve story. When my wife finally figured out that she needed to leave, it was right in the middle of Mass, and so she turned to our oldest, who was about 11 at that time, and said, Lucy, just stay here. And she's like, what? It's like, yeah, this was, a mile and a half from our house. She said, just stay here, and after Mass, somebody will give you a ride home. I always loved that detail because that really showed something about the nature of our parish, that she was just willing to leave, not even having to ask somebody. You knew that it was going to happen. It was this reliable insurance project. And so the social science really bears this out. Raj Chetty is an economist at Stanford and Harvard, and he studied economic mobility. What allows a child born in the lowest fifth of economics to rise up to the top? And he found that it really varies from place to place. A child born in the bottom quintile in Utah had an 11% chance of coming out in the top quintile. Same child born in Charlotte had less than a 5% chance. So why? Chetty did all this sort of economist magic and found two factors stood out independent of anything else. The percentage of intact families in the area, that is the percentage of children being raised by a pair of married parents, and the measures of social capital, like what Robert Putnam came up with in Bowling Alone. How much volunteering there was, how many bowling alleys, bowling leagues, how much civic engagement, how much churches. That's what predicted. If a kid lived somewhere where everybody around him was volunteering and where there were a lot of clubs and institutions, he was more likely to rise the ranks. And volunteering is not like, a lot of people think about volunteering or idleness, that this is like an individual virtue. I think that a lot of times you join a club for one reason, and, well, you know the look if you've been at the neighborhood pool and some guy starts walking towards you with his, and like it's not a wandering around. He's picked you out. You're the guy he's going to walk at. You know you're about to be voluntold. And I remember I would time my kids' swim matches because of this. I was really bad at it, but they asked me to do it, and so I did it. And there was one day after Mass in our old parish in Maryland, and I saw the look from the CYO, the Catholic Youth Organization. Basically, the parish athletic director was walking right at me with that look. Usually, I'm the guy who hangs around after church and talks to everyone, and my wife is like, come on, we got to go. But here, I was like, Katie, we got to go. She's like, what's going on? I was like, we got to go, but it's too crowded. Finally, he catches me. Tim, how's it going, Michael? I see Meg signed up for basketball, Tim. Yeah. Tim, there's enough girls that our parish is going to have its own team in the rec league. I said, that's great, Mike. I really got to go. He goes, well, we need a coach. I said, you know what, Mike? By tomorrow, I'll give you a list of potential coaches. Okay, Meg was in kindergarten at this point. Keep this in mind. Tim, I was hoping you could coach. I was like, Mike, you know what? Any other year, I'll do it, but I'm not this year. He goes, oh, no, is something wrong? Do you need help? I said, no, it's just I'm really busy working on a book. He said, what's the book about? I said, it's on the importance of community institutions. And so, yes. You're looking at the kindergarten girls basketball coach for St. Andrew Apostle Parish. This is what happens. They make us institutions, they help us in all of these ways, building that safety net, giving us more purpose, giving us an ability to climb the economic ladder. These are the little platoons that are the beating heart of the American dream. So the question is, what happens in the places where it seems dead? So part of my job as a journalist, I get to do what my colleague Byron York calls bar reporting, which is I sit down at the bar, and eventually the people start talking to me, asking why I'm there, and I learn about their community. I ask about politics, economics, etc. And so if you were to ever look at my expense report of 15 years at the Washington Examiner, you'd see a lot of McGillicuddy's, the different pubs on there. And actually, I used to really go to a lot of Irish pubs, largely because that's where I found you're most likely to find voters. Like college kids don't vote, and you don't want to be the creepy old guy at the college bar. At a hotel bar, there's going to be too many people from out of town. Irish pubs, it was kind of like yuppie crowd, men, women, old, young, Republican, Democrat. One kind of place I used to avoid was the roadside country bar. You know this place, there's not like here when you pull into a parking lot, there's like a cutout in the sidewalk. Here it's just like Route 44 and then gravel. And then if you park there, you walk up, like my rental car would be the only Japanese car in the parking lot. You walk up and you can't see in. If there's a window, there's a curtain behind it, so there's a neon lights. And when you open the first door, there's this like little antechamber. It's like a silent, dark room. And then when you open the second door, if you are wearing a suit and tie, the music stops and everybody stares at you. And anytime you try to talk to them about anything that even remotely touches on politics, they say, we don't talk about politics. Politicians politics is a bunch of BS, we don't talk about it. Well, in the 2016 election, in those same bars, they said politics is a bunch of BS, that's why we're supporting Donald Trump. So I went to these bars. One of them, and to pick a place, I picked Fayette County, Pennsylvania. And so I picked Fayette County because I want to go to Pennsylvania, and I found research showing that it had the biggest drop-off of church attendance of any county for both Protestants and Catholics. And then my next step of research is looking on Yelp to see where the best wings are served, and it was Smitty's. So I go to Smitty's, and while I'm sitting at the bar there, I started looking at more data. The overdose death rate was 57 per 100,000 in Fayette County, 50% higher than the state average, which was twice the national average. And I'm sitting at the bar there, and the unemployment rate, the men dropping out of the labor force, all that data is popping up. And so I realized, in a sad way, I'd come to the right place. Now, again, the wings at Smitty's were amazing. The clientele was very friendly. I asked them all about the town. They were telling me about it. And then I asked them about the economy, because you never ask about politics right away. The economy, I got two conflicting answers. One was, the economy here is horrible because there's no jobs. And then the economy here is terrible because you can't find anyone to work. Which one is true? So then, to bring them together, they start talking about, the welfare queens, the people who are just living off of the dole, and they tell these stories, and you always hear the same secondhand stories in any town across the country. Oh, my neighbor saw a woman trying to buy dog food with food stamps, and when they said you couldn't do that, she grabbed a T-bone steak and said, Fido's eating well tonight. And they go through these stories. My neighbor's brother has a girlfriend who's living off of food stamps, and she uses the food stamps to buy drugs, and then she sells those. And you hear these stories, and in the all-white clientele of Smitty's, there was definitely a racial undercurrent of these stories, but also the men telling these stories of these people who don't work were telling these stories at a bar at 2:30 on a Tuesday. I was at the bar at 2:30 on a Tuesday, but it was literally my job to be there, I will note. So I turned to Dave at the end of the bar. I say, Dave, you are here at 2:30 on a Tuesday, and he was not yet 60 years old. And I said, are you retired? He said, no, I can't work. I'm on disability. And he describes his back issues, 10 surgeries, absolutely excruciating. And I say, so the jobs here are all like manual laborers. You can't do a desk job. He says, I can't sit at a desk for more than half an hour. And I said, well, Dave, you've been sitting at the bar stool with me for about 90 minutes. But that's when Dave looked at me and said, well, I'm numb today. No, he said, I'm numb today because my son died this morning. And it was a drug overdose. And when Dave left, the bartender told me that Dave had given up drinking 12 years earlier, and he hadn't come back until that day. So those stats that I had been researching 90 minutes ago, that I knew that I was going to work into my article, they were abstract until that moment when I was looking in Dave's eyes. That's when they became real. That's when I realized that the suffering, that these places where the Friday night fish fries had dried up, where people said they didn't trust their neighbors and that's why they owned a gun, that they had real consequences. This wasn't just people who had lost their job at the factory or who couldn't get their dad's job at the factory. These were places that had real suffering. And you can't just attribute it to economics. It is about the collapse of the coffee shop. After the factory closes, the coffee shop next to the factory where the guys used to meet up, that goes out of business. And then the church empties out. And then the public school loses its most interested parents. And so when we talk about deaths of despair, overdoses and suicide, they are It has to, you can blame the cartels these days, in the last few years, certainly blame the fentanyl, but before that, you blame social disconnection, the lack of belonging. A psychiatrist, Aaron Cariati, explained this among suicides as well. We're not living in community anymore, he said. We're living in isolation. We don't have people to provide meaning and give us hope. The Boston Globe reported, even outside of the despair, those more socially isolated were more likely to die during a given period than their socially connected neighbors, even after you correct for age, gender, and lifestyle choices. So heart attacks are more likely among the socially isolated. Another thing, and this is what my most recent book, Family Unfriendly, was about, that it causes is the retreat from marriage and the collapse in the birth rate. If you want to know who's not getting married now, it's not, simply a matter of people getting more education and staying in grad school longer. That happens, and that does drive down the birth rate. But primarily, the retreat from marriage is among the working class. It's among the disconnected. The reason people aren't forming families is because, once again, it takes a village to raise a child. And if you don't feel you have that village, well, just even marriage is harder. You guys all know. You all had sort of slightly older couples that you looked at and you said, okay, wait a second. That's what marriage is about. Oh, wow, I just saw how he dealt with that, how she dealt with that. You think, oh, it is actually possible to have 3 or 4 kids. Wow, maybe if I have a girl, she'll be well behaved, unlike my own boys. All of these things that you learn from other families. And then the babysitters that you call on, and not just the mentoring, but the actual support. The other people in your neighborhood with kids running around. Family formation is in decline in the U.S. It's the biggest story. Our birth rate has fallen from 2.1 down to 1.6. We have fewer children in America today than we did 10 years ago. And one of the people will talk about affordability. That's part of it. The biggest part of it is the lack of belonging, is that people sometimes think, okay, well, I have to be able to raise these kids myself, or maybe the government can help me. But if there's not enough government help, or if I can't afford it myself, what's going to help me? Because they don't have the neighbor. They don't have the church group. They don't live near grandma. The eroded power and presence of churches, unions, veterans organizations, and athletic groups, this is a Brad Wilcox quote, in the lives of middle America has undercut many of the habits of the heart that it would take to sustain strong families. So what's causing that? One way I look at it is 2 things that sound opposite are really the same, and they're both happening in the U.S. One is over-centralization of our attention, of the economy, of power, and the other is a hyper-individualism. Again, these sound opposite, right? Like, are we further apart or are we closer together? They're kind of 2 sides of the same coin. That's an idea that Alexis de Tocqueville actually laid out almost 200 years ago. One is crowding out of local institutions. One economist did a study about the New Deal, and he found that in the places that got more money from the central government, from the federal government, because they had more powerful politicians, there was a greater drop-off in the amount of money that churches would spend on the poor. So that was, and he found a decreasing government expenditure, or as he put it, then when the government spending went down, decreases in government expenditures led to significant increases in church activity. So there is the New Deal, the Great Society. They made it so that fewer people slipped through the cracks. That's a lot of good stuff that happened there. But they also made it that fewer people were showing up at their soup kitchen to volunteer. Fewer of the needy people were getting a human touch, were getting to know their neighbors. So that crowding out of over-centralization happens. It also happens with the mass media. We're more likely to know what's going on in the nation's capital or in New York than around the corner than we were before. That, of course, is going to erode civic connection. Local newspapers are dying everywhere, but everybody has cable 24/7, and even that's sort of old-fashioned. We have Twitter, even more than that. So belonging, though, and then the hyper-individualism comes in. I think the phones are a huge part of this. It allows us to enter into our own little world where we're detached from everybody. If you guys see what a kids waiting at the school bus look like, and it kind of depresses you, right? They're all staring at their phone. That's what most of us grown-ups look like, too, half the time, if you look around. We know each other less, but it's not just because of the technology. I think it's rooted in a change in the mindset. Individualism is a central part of America. It's part of what makes us great. I was once in Germany, and this cabinet minister said, Europe has historically had two types of people, the kind of people who follow rules and do what they're told, and the kind of people who strike out on their own, but that second part got on a boat one day and all went to America. So that is us. We are starters. We are individualists. But that is always thrived in a context of community, surrounded by an infrastructure of belonging, of institutions. And as those institutions wither away, but our individualism grows, the individualism goes from being this great virtue to being an excess, to us not trusting other people, to us thinking about interpersonal relationships as actually being, well, this is just a transaction. That's how a lot of young people talk about marriage. Well, we both decided that we would benefit from this bilateral relationship instead of the older Catholic understanding that a lot of other religions have, which is it's actually a covenant between the couple and the rest of the community. And so this hyper-individualism, if everything's just a transaction, then you don't actually belong. Because what is belonging? It means having some obligations that you didn't necessarily choose. I belong to a parish because I wanted to go to Mass, because I wanted to send my kids to the parish school, not because I wanted to coach kindergarten girls basketball. That idea of accepting unchosen obligations, that's really rejected today. And that's what belonging does. One of the things I loved about my parish was you had to do certain volunteer hours. And so an easy thing to do was to clean up at the end of the parish picnic. Because one of the things was at that point the food and the keg were free to the volunteers. But usually what that meant, this is in Washington, D.C., it meant a former member of Congress, a lobbyist, a woman who owns her own business, are all taking orders from the new immigrant from Eritrea on how to clean up and which tables to fold up. That sort of thing happens only when you belong to an institution. And what made things worse recently? Obviously, the lockdowns. Not only did people stop showing up for a few months, a lot of them didn't return. That certainly happened with church, and probably a lot of you experienced that with your local chapters. But also there was this one article that went around that was very popular. It was about the upsides of masks. It had nothing to do with the spread of the virus. It was about how it gave you anonymity. And one of the lines was, one of the virtues of masks is that it will save you from conversation with that too chatty neighbor. And I thought, man, my colleagues in the media really don't like their neighbors. Schools. When our county would defend keeping the schools closed for an entire year, they said, school is just a building. So this is about learning. And tried to argue that what we had been getting from our schools could be approximated with some online videos or with sending home a packet. These ideas that the belonging, the community, the getting to know people, showing up and seeing the same faces and having the spontaneous conversations outside wasn't valuable. That was really it wasn't just harmful. It reflected how we had become too individualistic and too transactional. So this, I think, is the crisis of the day. And so then the question is, what do we do about it? There's a couple U.S. senators who identified this. Chris Murphy from Connecticut, I was glad he did, but when he started talking about, well, what can the Senate do about this? I thought, you cannot make a federal Department of Local Community Cohesion. that would undermine itself. In fact, decentralizing a lot of things would help. Decentralizing the safety net back to a local level and turning the federal government into a thing that catches those organizations or funds them would probably be beneficial. And so in Alienated America, the book I'm mostly talking about here from 2019, I had a solutions chapter. Now this is always daunting. My first book I wrote, it was just problems. And it was problem, index. And somebody was like, if you write another book, it needs a solution chapter. My second book, also about economics, I read over the solutions chapter a year later. It was like, we need a gold standard. There's a bunch of things that later I decided was a bad idea. But this one, I have to write a solutions chapter. And I said, what if there is no central solution? A bunch of little ones, change the way our labor unions work, make more sidewalks, make it so that not everybody is so car dependent, that way they bump into their neighbors. All these things are going to help, but there is no one big solution. So when I talked at colleges, a lot of times there would be a student center, and it would be named after some billionaire donor. So it's a David Coleman Student Center. And I said, if any of you become billionaires, build institutions of civil society like this. Then I would show a sign from behind the baseball diamond at my old parish in Maryland. It said, DeTolli's Diamond, named after Mike DeTolli. Mike DeTolli was not a billionaire. He was a baseball dad who died in his 50s. But after his kids were too old to play t-ball and Little League, he kept coaching. And I said, not all of you can be David Coleman or Betsy DeVos or whatever and fund these big places, but every one of you can be a Mike DeToli. Every one of you can be one of there is no one big solution, there's 100,000 small ones, and every one of you can be that solution. And I just want to end with another family-related things. We were having a conversation, my priest and I, during one of the Friday fish fries years back, and I talked about this over-centralization thing, how the parish lost a lot of what it used to do. And he said, well, what should we be doing now? I said, well, don't try to compete with the government. That doesn't make any sense. He said, fine, but what is the unmet need of everybody in this room? And I thought that was the best question, to look around your community and say, what is the unmet need? When I looked around the room, it was so diverse. Again, we have, cab drivers from Eritrea and lobbyists and all that, but they were mostly moms and dads in this car-dependent suburb. And I said, what we all need is somewhere to bring our children and ignore them while we hang out with other adults. Now again, you come up with an idea and you present it to an institution, you have just volunteered to bring that institution, that idea into fruition. So I started a Friday night t-ball program based on a neighboring parish. And we would cook up burgers or order pizza during Lent, and we'd cook up burgers on Friday night, and I ran t-ball, which was just an excuse to bring the families together. Like if the kids ever ran the bases in the right order, it was a huge victory. And we fed them, and we told them to bring all their family. We made the parents a little less helicoptery. And I sent out an email. I said, by the way, this t-ball program, do not think of it as the first step on your child's road to a D1 scholarship. One parent the next day showed up in the parking lot, looked around and said, you mean I already should have taken the first step? I was like, no! Because in DC, we have everything is this super intensive travel sports program that tears apart communities, that tears apart families. And I was like, no, what we need is a low stakes place to bring our families. And so this really is what I think one of the main things that is needed, is a place to show people, if you get married and have kids and try to have a family, we will support you. There's all sorts of people out there, and you guys know much better than I do what needs support. But right now, much more than any time in the past, that's what people need. They need a sense of purpose. They need a sense of belonging. And getting married and having kids will be one of the best ways, not only for them to belong to their family, but then that family, hopefully, will drag them out into the broader community. A final note about the virtues of parenting. I think getting married and having kids makes you better. I think being surrounded by other people who have kids makes everybody better. And not everybody is called to marriage and family. Again, I'm a Catholic. All my favorite priests are unmarried and have no kids. But as a Christian, I think the Bible tells me to feed the hungry and clothe the naked. The groups, the organizations, the activities that Rotary does, it takes very seriously that. But for all of us, most people are not Rotarians. But for parents, I wake up every morning. There are hungry, naked people in my house. They're right there. It lifts us to the next level to start a family. And so as we're serving communities, that's what we ought to look for. How can we help people on this very noble task of and one of the best ways to rope them in the community of starting and running a family? Thank you all very much.
Tim, I don't know if you remember who it was. We happened to be at it was a Republican, some Republican dinner, and so Tim was there at the table, and we got to sit with the congressman or some VIP, and it was a little-known congressman from South Dakota, who I thought, oh my gosh, we get the loser's table, right? Well, it was John Thune, who's now the Senate United States Majority Leader, but well, it was 25 years due. But Tim, you weren't here earlier when I said this, presented this other one. Paul Harris is the founder of Rotary. And for every $1,000 that we give to the Rotary Foundation, Paul Harris is a fellow is awarded. So on behalf of District 7570 and Rotary, and for the work that you're doing to help rebuild and bring the attention and the information to our country and to the world about the need for civil society, institutions, to be rebuilt, the family, the basic structure. I want to say thank you for coming and sharing that with us, and I want to present you this Paul Harris Fellow.